My friends, today we have a collection of the most unusual, obscure, and rare gaming lore. From the most ridiculous and secretive representation of a GoldenEye stage in another game, to one of the most bizarre yet prescient playground rumors ever posted anywhere, to a game that never came to fruition at all. Let's grab a warm beverage and ponder this deep gamer folklore.
Here we go!
Whenever I think of an old game, what floods to mind are the memories, speedrunners, history, and all the stories that were written and pondered, with the game serving more as a backdrop for life in a different time. While GoldenEye or Super Mario 64 were certainly great games, defining and pioneering genres, they served as a sort of platform for gamers to go out there and write history in their own way. One thing that causes me to perhaps even deeply ponder is the idea of games that could have served as this kind of platform, but were never released or even finished at all. There are numerous such games over the course of time, and that includes the Nintendo 64 era. But one such game that was potentially planned for both N64 and PlayStation only to be cancelled or not finished was one by the name of Aquaria. Aquaria was a water-themed game, ostensibly planned and worked on by a company called Lobotomy Software, who were best known for porting Duke Nukem 3D and Quake to the Sega Saturn, as well as making a game called Power Slave, or Exhumed depending on the region. I checked out a speedrun of that game, and it has the kind of vibe and movement which reminds me of Quake and Doom from that era, though I've never played it myself, so let me know if you've ever played it in the comments. This is one of those games that was initially released on Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and MS-DOS, but has since been released on numerous platforms. One of those games that was released everywhere but Nintendo. So it does seem a bit unusual that this studio was indeed working on a Nintendo 64 video game, but according to website Unseen64, we have some evidence and quotes about the Aquaria project. According to a quote found in Game Fan magazine issue 5, published in May 1997, Aquaria was compared to Nights into Dreams, a Sega Saturn classic of the era, and Lobotomy were said to be applying to develop for the Nintendo 64, with Aquaria planned to be their first N64 game. Interestingly, Unseen64 found another quote from another gaming magazine around this time, but they clarify almost immediately that they think the magazine mixed up Aquaria with another game. We'll learn why in a few moments. From Computer and Video Games issue 192. Lobotomy's first N64 game, Aquaria, already looks fantastic. The graphics run at 60 FPS and are apparently some of the best ever seen. Enix are converting the game to PlayStation. However, Unseen64 are quick to point out that Computer and Video Game probably confused Aquaria with Aqua Prophecy or another cancelled Enix game for PlayStation, and they believe this based on a following conversation they would have with one of the developers of Aquaria. Thanks to our friend Ross Silliphant in 2015, we published an interview with Brian McNeely, former Lobotomy software developer, who shared some memories about their work on Aquaria. We had a playable demo of Aquaria up and running on PlayStation. It was a free-roaming, third-person underwater adventure game where you controlled an alien merman character. The Knights comparison ties into how fluid the controls were. You could do various dolphin-like acrobatics to maneuver through the environment. In addition to the playable demo, I had the majority of the design pretty much completed, but when the company began to close its doors, we had to stop development. At one point, we were contacted by Sega to possibly make the next Echo the Dolphin game, and we sent them our Aquaria prototype, but that never panned out. If you've ever played Echo the Dolphin Defender of the Future, you can get a pretty good idea for how the core character controls and camera system for Aquaria and how these were designed. And that is pretty much that. One line in a magazine, another line likely misattributed in another magazine, and then a conversation with a developer who worked on the game. That's pretty much all the remaining evidence that there is Aquaria ever existed as a game that was ever in the works. There are no pictures or video clips that ever made it online, making it a true piece of vaporware. We can assume that the quote about Aquaria looking fantastic and running at 60 FPS was indeed misattributed and should have been about another game, because according to Brian McNeely, Aquaria never seems to have really gotten that far along. Echo the Dolphin Defender of the Future was eventually developed by Appaloosa Entertainment and released for Sega Dreamcast in the year 2000, and PlayStation 2 after that. Meanwhile, Lobotomy Software was shifted around, being acquired by Crave Entertainment and then shut down by 1999, with Aquaria never coming to fruition. While Echo Defender of the Future may have the most remnants or influence that came from the early work on Aquaria, I can't help but ponder what Aquaria on the Nintendo 64 would have looked, felt, or played like. When I think of an underwater game and the Nintendo 64, the first thing that comes into my mind is the Aquas level from Star Fox 64. A slow, methodical, kind of clunky stage that felt overwhelming for the console, pushing it to its very limits. I would hope that Aquaria would have found a way to play more smoothly, swimmingly, pun intended, and ultimately more like Echo Defender of the Future. On the other hand, the N64 does have some games with remarkable water physics, like Wave Race 64, so maybe a sort of Nights into Dreams underwater would have indeed been possible on the console. Further muddying the water on researching and pondering Aquaria is the fact that a completely unrelated game with the name Aquaria was released in the year 2007. Whatever the case may be, I always find it somewhat tragic when a game or project never comes to fruition, and I can't help but ponder, if the game did come about, what memories could have been made in playing it. Would it be a game people still play today with stories and lore of speedrunners, ROM hackers, and other gamers who dedicated parts of their lives to playing and exploring the game? Or would it have been mostly forgotten by now, like so many other third-party games of that time? It's simply the thing one could best ponder ironically while staring out into the deep blue ocean, the kind of place Aquaria would have liked to explore, play, and make those memories. So here's something which is getting to be among the most obscure gaming Easter eggs I can possibly fathom, and this one has to do with GoldenEye, so it's quite remarkable. In fact, it's a game in which you can unlock a faithful recreation of a famous GoldenEye multiplayer map. But I'd be willing to bet that maybe only a few dozen people have ever done this. It's that obscure. So on this channel, we all know that GoldenEye 007 and its spiritual successor Perfect Dark are great games for the Nintendo 64 console. And dare I say, I do hear arguments that Perfect Dark is the all-round better game, though what does it really matter? Comparing games is silly, and they are two iconic masterpieces. What fewer people know is that there is a game called Perfect Dark for the Game Boy Color, rather than the Nintendo 64. Now, this game is a strange artifact, to say the least. It's actually a full-blown prequel to the N64 shooter, which follows Joanna Dark in 2022 during her final training at the Carrington Institute. Keep in mind the N64 game takes place in 2023. After her training, Joanna goes on her first real mission, taking down some kind of cyborg manufacturing operation in the South American Amazon jungle and uncovering intel on Datadyne, the rival corporation to Carrington's Institute. Yeah, it's strange and unusual. I mean, look at this insane, boss fight or something, throwing stars at one another across some fiery pit. It's truly remarkable stuff. Instead of a first-person view, you get a top-down, multi-directional shooter where you navigate these strange-looking levels. I don't know, it just all feels so surreal. Apparently the game is super hard as well, though very few have ever played it. I mean, there are literally 0 speedruns of the game submitted on speedrun.com. Compare this to the thousands of people who have played single-level runs on the N64 version. However, the Game Boy Color version had some pretty cool features, apparently having rumble features and support for link cable multiplayer matches. Keep that in mind in a moment, and it even had some Game Boy printer functionality, which again, it's how many people in the world ever used that? Game Boy printer, Perfect Dark on Game Boy. Insane. But here's the crazy GoldenEye tie-in that I was only just alerted to by friend of the channel, an absolute expert in all things rareware, the Rare Gamer, who told me this. If you complete the entire game of Perfect Dark, which again is apparently quite difficult on Game Boy, you will unlock 2 bonus multiplayer stages. Now here's the thing, you can only play these stages if you have the link cable, and a friend who also has a copy of this perfect dark Game Boy version. So now we're getting very, very obscure. But those multiplayer maps, they're named Military Archives 1 and 2, remakes of GoldenEye's Archives stage, one of the classic multiplayer stages in the game, recreated faithfully in this absolutely unhinged and obscure Game Boy version of Perfect Dark. Rare Gamer even painstakingly screen capped the entire map a few pixels at a time, assembling the map like a jigsaw puzzle, and yeah, it looks bang on to GoldenEye's Archives, at least from the top-down perspective. And he's assembled this walkthrough, going through the map, compared with the GoldenEye version, the Game Boy version. Again, this all takes place in Perfect Dark. There are the secret passageways, though they're not blocked off by walls or doors in the Game Boy version, and it's a pretty faithful recreation. And it's just crazy because, how many people could possibly have ever played this? I can't find data on sales numbers for this Game Boy version, but I sincerely doubt it's over 100,000. There's just no way. It's probably less than 10,000. So of those people, how many beat the game to begin with? How many had a Game Boy Link cable? How many had a friend with the game as well? And how many actually played on some kind of multiplayer match on GoldenEye's Archives level in Perfect Dark on Game Boy? It may genuinely be zero, or just Rare Gamer being the only guy who has ever played it and looked deeply into the game to figure it out and go through the motions of playing it through. Maybe the developers did as well, of course, but how many can it be? A few dozen at most? I just can't believe it being too much more than that. Truly, what an insane and obscure piece of gaming lore. I'm stunned and in awe of this one, my friends. If you somehow have ever played this map, or if you even just know about Perfect Dark on Game Boy at all, do indeed let me know in the comments. It's just too much to ponder. One of the craziest posts I've ever come across as it pertains to this era of gaming is this one from the r/retro gaming subreddit. The OP made in November 2024 reads this. And keep in mind, this particular opening post is not the one that is truly remarkable, though it sets things up and does sound like a classic rumor. What's the weirdest playground video game rumor you ever heard growing up? Everyone has talked about Mew under the truck in Pokemon or Tomb Raider clothesless codes, but do you have any that you heard as a kid that you never heard anywhere else? One for me was a kid telling me that in Donkey Kong 64, after freeing K. Lumsy, he would break free and mock you for freeing him, turning out to be the actual final boss. The fight would use all 5 Kongs, and then after beating him, you would have to fight a skeleton version of him with whatever Kongs you wanted. Except he could trap Kongs inside his rib cage, and if you beat him while they were still trapped, you wouldn't be able to use them again after beating the boss to try to collect everything. It's such a weirdly specific thing that whenever I think about it, I wonder if my friend was mixing it up with something else he played or saw in a movie. So hey, that's cool and funny, hearkening to the possibility of a true ending in a video game, and the kind of thing I could see getting passed around schoolyards and early internet forums back in the day. But the top comment on this thread is what I really wanted to bring to attention, and it harkens a remarkable, crazy postulation. A friend of mine told me there was a voice-activated version of Game Genie that could pretty much do whatever you told it to. Like if you accidentally said, "oh crap," too loud, all the enemies would turn into turds, etc. Okay, now this is just insane because while this is obviously not true, and just some cool kid trying to be as cool as possible, my uncle works at Game Genie or whatever, and the comments are mostly jovially lampooning, having this kind of friend, the thing is, with the advent of modern generative artificial intelligence, this kind of thing could be possible. Hey Gemini, make the guards extremely large, give the guards red hats, make the guards look like Pierce Brosnan, turn the guards into donkeys, or whatever. Generative AI is getting closer to be able to do things like this, if not already. It would take a very certain type of game and coding to make it work, but having a kind of a dream fantasy game that changes at every single one of your requests would have been something totally impossible 30 years ago, but is very much plausible today. Could this commenter's friend have been a time traveler? Okay, I'm mostly joking about that, But it's just crazy that such a silly rumor could end up being something that could happen one day. Well, that'll do it, my friends. A huge thanks for watching. Thanks to the channel members and Patreon supporters for all of your support. Stay true, my friends, and I will see you in the next stream, video, or fireside.